So I'm the director of the Centre for Applied Autism Research at the University of Bath, and with my colleagues there, Ailsa, Chris and Katie, and we were opened by Dame Uta Frith last year, who some of you may know. And just to have a little plug, some of the things we do for free are, if you know a young person who's thinking of going to university, then we have an autism summer school for young people on the spectrum who are thinking of transitioning to university. And if we have students or recent graduates who are looking for employment, we also have an employment school there. So just to plug that, if you know anyone who'd like to apply, there are the websites. So the slides are all in your packs, so there's some websites that come up. You don't need to write them down because they are all there. Okay, but I'm not going to be talking about those programs today. Today I'm talking about digital autism, really to highlight that when we talk about technology and autism, we're talking digital technologies today. And what I'd like to talk about really is, well, why are we talking about technology and autism? What's the point of this topic? Is it the sense that we're talking about intervention and we're trying to intervene and use digital technologies to intervene with autistic people and try and adjust them so that they can better integrate with the people who aren't autistic? Or do we have an agenda based more around inclusion and we're developing digital technologies so that autistic people can be included? So there's a subtle distinction, maybe two sides of the same coin between intervention and inclusion that I'd like to talk about today and give some examples from robots, social media, some projects that we're working on at the end there, digital social stories, about finding the right technologies, and also what we might mean by when we're looking for evidence for all of these things. But firstly, I want to look at what does it mean to be digital and in this sense, because we're talking about autism and the use of digital technology, but what's the context of that in terms of how people are using technology? So this sense of inclusion or integration has been reflected upon in the journal Autism, which is the NAS journal, and there was a piece earlier on in the year that really reflected upon actually the illusion of inclusion and how integration has dominated over inclusion, and the distinction is made in the bottom lines here where this is within the context of education, and many children on the spectrum are in mainstream schools, but if you're in a mainstream school sitting on a desk outside in the corridor by yourself, you might meet some index of integration, but you're not particularly well included within that classroom. Or if you have a TA sitting with you and the only person you speak to in the classroom is that TA, then you're integrated into the classroom, but potentially not included in the classroom. So they're using the distinction between integration or intervention and inclusion. So what I'd like to discuss really is that distinction. Inclusion demands that we change the existing education environment in order to respond to the diverse needs. So the inclusion element is the rest of the world changing, whereas the integration is trying to change the or intervene with the individual. So that's the kind of distinction that I'm going to be alluding to throughout the talk. So in terms of the digital context, a recent survey in America, but where America leads, we will tend to follow in terms of integration. A survey of teenagers was showing that 95% have a smartphone now. So the vast majority of young people are having smartphones. And people have used terms such as digital immigrants versus digital natives. So the digital natives are people probably born this millennium really, have just been born into a world of technology, and it's almost a kind of a second nature. Whereas older people like me are more digital immigrants where we're having to learn this new digital world. So there's kind of distinction between a fundamental change in younger people. And the survey kind of looked at, well, what are these young people doing on, with their digital technologies? And kind of the big things that they're doing, really, as you can imagine, probably looking at YouTube, Instagram, Snapchat, and Facebook. They're the biggies that are being used. But importantly, almost half of the young people are saying that they're constantly, almost constantly online. And I'm sure many of us are familiar with this. Always having the phone on hand and always referring to it, no matter what you're doing. And there's another group of kind of using it pretty much at least several times a day, if not more. So the vast majority of young people aren't just doing this once or twice. They're engaging in kind of social media type activities, half of them pretty much, almost constantly online. So that's the digital context within which we're looking at digital autism. Anyway, so you think, well, presumably they're doing this because they think it's a great asset, and you're saying, do you think this is positive or negative? And the same survey was showing, well, for a third of people, they think it's kind of positive, but half of people think, well, it's neither positive or negative, really. But there's also around a quarter of people who think, actually, this is quite a negative experience that I'm engaging in most of the time. So there's positives and negatives with the dominance of technology within our lives, all of which I'm sure you're kind of familiar with at some level. But this isn't just the kids. They kind of, as I'm sure you're aware, divide up different names depending which kind of technological generation you're in. And there's the millennials who are kind of born between 81 and 96. There's Generation X, if you're kind of born between 65, and the boomers, who were born after the Second World War. But you can see here that pretty much the results for the teenagers extend to adults as well. So the vast majority of people own smartphones, they're using tablets and social media. Maybe not those born before the end of the Second World War, so what they call the silence generation. But maybe for everyone born after 1945, we have heavy internet use based around social media. Okay, so as I show, like, majority of Americans are now using YouTube and Facebook. This is what most people are doing, and they're doing it for at least a couple of hours a day. So there's this new technology, and this is kind of global statistics now. So not just America, the same stats are found across Europe and beyond. And if you take a global average, people are pretty much using social media for over 2 hours a day on average. Obviously, some people are a lot more than that, so you have variability within that. So there's this behaviour that people are doing for hours on end every single day, and that's the digital context within which we are considering digital autism. And the sense of inclusion as opposed to intervention within a digital world. So there's a sense that this digital environment might be beneficial for autistic people. In that autistic people, it's argued, have challenges with social processing, that's kind of diagnostic in terms of autism, but there are also relative strengths that can be conceptualized as repetitive behaviors, or having a strong focus, or special interests, or being able to attend to things for a long time, or having a strength in attention to detail, or thinking systematically or logically. And these culminations of strengths associated with autism are argued to represent strengths in thinking about the non-social world, or the physical world, which includes technologies. So it's argued that maybe interventions, it's argued, might be particularly amenable for autistic people because they're engaging with technologies, and maybe there's some kind of digital affinity between autistic people and technology. However, as I've kind of just alluded to, maybe autistic people might benefit from technology, but it's in within the environment where people are using digital technologies all the time, whether they're autistic or not. So we're all kind of benefiting from technologies and suffering on occasion too. But maybe is there something special about the sense of being autistic that might be particularly beneficial for autistic people? So some research through past decades has kind of, if you look through, identified the aspects of assessments used to assess autistic people. For example, the Sally Ann task. And if you can see, that's a kind of representation of it. You might be familiar with it, where Sally has a marble and she puts it in her basket, and while she's gone, Anne moves it into the box, so when she comes back, where will she look for the marble? Kind of classic Sally Ann task, and typically autistic children underperform on this task. However, what Swetnam was showing was that if you embed this within technology, autistic children can learn this task very quickly. So this kind of technology-mediated version, you don't get the same difference between autistic and non-autistic children in theory of mind type abilities. Also, the Wisconsin card sorting task is used to assess executive functioning, our capacities for flexible thought and planning. And with a task like this, you're given a card like that, and you have to think of a rule to match it to one of these. So if you're matching by colour, you might put it here. If you're matching by number, and you think, well, there's 2 elements there, I'll match it there. Or if you're matching by shape, then you might put it on this one here. So you've got a choice to think, how am I going to match that? And you have trial and error, and the experimenter says, no, you're wrong, and then say, oh, you're right. And you kind of work out what that rule is, and then unbeknown to you, the experimenter changes the rule. So you then have to reconceptualize what the rule might be. And this is where the sense of autistic people perseverating comes in that autistic people can keep going with the old rule for much, much longer. However, what Ozanov showed years ago was that does happen if you do this with a human experimenter, but if you do a computer-based version, again, the differences disappear between autistic and non-autistic people. Similarly, we've done some research on emotion recognition, and again, we've shown that you do get deficits in autistic people recognizing human emotions, but if you're looking at cartoons or not such human representations, then differences disappear. So by digitally mediating the tasks which autistic people typically underperform on, you remove these differences to suggest, okay, maybe there is something around the digital world where the difficulties that people with autism or autistic people can face don't manifest when being assessed digitally. So there's some potential benefits then of using digital technology for autistic people, and the NAS's website says, yeah, of course there are some, and there's some guidance for parents here saying that you can learn new skills, you can be motivated. You can see it's not a huge array of benefits here, but there's kind of motivational benefits potentially. And maybe they can facilitate making your own choices and those kind of things. But there is, we've always kind of alluded to as well, a potential flip side, and there is also some limitations associated with that. And all this is on the website of the NAS. In that this tends not to generalise. So if a child, an autistic child, learns a capability within one scenario, it tends not to generalise to other situations. So if you were doing the classic kind of psychological test where you were learning from photos of emotions and you were trying to recognise those emotions and saying that's a happy emotion, that's a sad emotion, even if your performance improves upon that computer-based task, it then seems to not generalise to the real world. So that generalisation seems to be a real issue. So there are very great limitations to using technologies. So potentially strengths and potentially weaknesses. So Mazurek did a study looking at autistic adults and saying, well, what do you do? What do you use technology for? And you can see here that on average, autistic adults were using social networks for 3 hours a day. Okay, 5 days a week. So this was interesting. It's not immediately obvious. If you are being characterised as having a deficit in social communication and interaction, would you be using social media? It's not an obvious yes, just like everyone else, we would be using social media if you have a diagnosis of a social communication and interaction disorder. But this study suggested actually autistic adults are using social media as much, if not more, than non-autistic adults. And they're using it with a vast array of friends in an online context. So we found this saying, okay, what are you doing in this social media? And you can see it's social connection, keeping in touch. It's socially mediated activity being used in an online environment. So again, this is what other people are doing, but this is also what autistic people are doing. And it wasn't immediately obvious given the social deficits within the kind of face-to-face environment. But within this online digital environment, this is what autistic adults are reporting they were doing. They're engaging in social interaction. So we looked at Facebook and groups and communities to see kind of what was going on, and clearly had appropriate ethical considerations to look at how autistic people were talking to each other in these kind of Facebook-type communities. And we took an autistic group and a non-autistic group, and it was difficult to work out, well, how might you match the different groups? So we matched them on the number of activities, and it was a group of people who'd experienced cancer was well matched in terms of the kinds of people who were in the group. And we looked at their active memberships and what they were posting, and looked at the last 100 posts, and you couldn't tell the difference between them. About half of both groups were containing emotionally laden words, and were comparably empathic, appropriately empathic. I know what that's like, you might like to try this. So within both groups, unless cancer or autism was specifically mentioned, the judges couldn't tell whether the online communications were between autistic people or non-autistic people in this online environment. So, as I'm sure you're aware, many theories of autism suggest there are emotion processing deficits or deficits in empathy, but in this online environment, they're not to be found. So we looked at what kind of emotions were being expressed, and overwhelmingly they were positive, and there are different emotions, sadness, angry. But I think, again, between the two groups, you can see that similarity really is the overarching feature, how similar the autistic group is to the non-autistic groups. And we did this with a range of groups, and we keep getting the same findings. Okay, so we then asked a question, well, has autism impacted on your freedom to talk online? It seems like in an online environment, a lot of empathic social interaction is occurring. So if people were self-identified as being autistic, then could they respond to our survey? And what the autistic people told us was The vast majority of them said yes, actually we do find it much more easier to communicate digitally than non-digitally face-to-face. And then the second one was the real advantages of being able to interact with other people who are like me, because I don't tend to go out or meet socially, so I can socialise online with people who are also autistic. Some people found it the same, and I think one person thought actually interacting online was harder. And there's a little other group like, good question, so I didn't quite answer the question. But overarchingly, people did find digital communication easier. And they gave us quotes like, although I've learned to talk to people face-to-face, it's still 10 times easier online. I can normally talk on Facebook, but don't face-to-face. Yes, it's easier for me to socialise online. So why might that be? When talking online, I feel so much more at ease. There's a lot less pressure to understand those kind of social cues. They're not there in that online environment. It's talk about, I don't have to read any gestures. If there are gestures like smileys, they're all quite explicit. So there's not those subtle social cues that have to also be interpreted that often accompany face-to-face communication. Timing was a big feature as well. In the online it's better for the same reason why I don't use a telephone. I need time to think through. So online communication, I have time to think through my response. And I'm given the freedom to do that. Whereas the social world obviously typically is very rapid. The online social world, you're given that flexibility of time to think about things. Freedom to take the time I need to respond. I can read better than I listen, so I misunderstand less because of the timing issue. And there's a but, and of course there's always a but, and it's that generalisation before. It's much easier for me to talk online, email, text, or whatever. I get too comfortable with it, and it makes it harder for me to do it face-to-face. So there might be a cost to this online environment. It's better to talk online, but the internet doesn't help in learning how to deal with people face-to-face. Okay, so I'm still feeling a sense of loneliness through doing this. And it's easier to socialise online, though I still have a lot of trouble in everyday life. So there doesn't seem to be any generalisation from this online digital social experience through to face-to-face social experience. A very recent study by Ward looked at 106 autistic adults, found that half of them using Facebook, about 20% were using Twitter, and those people using Facebook reported greater happiness than people who weren't using Facebook. So again, it suggests that this kind of online social interaction is found to be rewarding, at least in this environment. And this finding didn't extend to Twitter, and they were arguing, well, Twitter can often be not so much the social, but can be a lot of information sharing type of activities. So they didn't get this effect for Twitter, but through a social media platform like Facebook, they did find that it was associated with a sense of feeling happier in life. So there's been a lot of research for a decade now about autistic culture online, and these are some quotes from autistic people that Davidson's pulled together in her paper, just to kind of reflect upon this online digital world does seem to be appealing to a lot of people. Maybe not everybody who has autistic, but some autistic people. So of those autistics on the internet who discuss its use, we all agree it's an amazing tool. We've already got our own country. It's a cyber country called the internet, and it's perfect. The internet provides at least some of those on the spectrum with a means to develop and maintain social relationships. The internet has begun to challenge stereotypes surrounding the competence of people with autism to communicate effectively, and the use of the internet by individuals with autism as related to conditions is part of a movement of self-advocacy. So there's a whole range of issues in there, and the penultimate one is as I'm kind of saying, it's almost as if I don't feel autistic online. It's only if face-to-face I'm having the characteristic difficulties with autism, but I don't have those in an online environment. And the last point really is how technology has enabled the spread of the neurodiversity movement and given a voice to a lot of autistic people and beyond about accepting autism as a difference rather than a disability. So there's a lot of really interesting comments coming from the autism community themselves about the benefits of this digital environment within which we can now socially interact. So it's not all positive, of course. There are also risks associated with the internet. We're always seeing headlines around maybe relating to compulsive use or cyberbullying or addiction of some level, hacking, which we'll be talking about hacking later specifically. But some research is saying, well, these are kind of general problems of the internet. And with compulsive use, these may not be autism-specific difficulties with using the internet. Yes, we need to be mindful of the risks of using the internet, but maybe not autism specific. Maybe everyone needs to be mindful of the risks, as Shane Simpson and colleagues were arguing. But that kind of sense of compulsive use and the sense of using that the internet is dominating our lives and people are always on the phone, and that's a negative thing, has led to, and you see them all the time, articles around digital detoxing, and maybe you should take your phones away from a kid for a week, or have a 7-day digital detox, or try not to use social media between 6 and 8 in the evening, or have periods where you're not using. And you see articles like this all the time, espousing the benefits of digital detoxing. And clearly that's coming again from the mainstream environment where largely digital immigrants, such as myself, are seeing digital media as a block between me and my child. I would like to talk to my child, but they're using a phone, so they're not looking at me and interacting with me because they're off using social media and interacting with people who aren't in the room. So from that I get a sense of, well, a digital detox will allow us bonding time in that face-to-face context. But then when you think about the autistic context, if a world has been created that allows social interaction and communication that they feel comfortable with, and then people are saying, hey, let's have a detox, let's take that away from you, that's a very different proposition to start suggesting digital detox for the autistic community, who suddenly have been given a tool that allows and enables for people who are responding to this, maybe not the entire autistic community, but large swathe of the autistic community who are finding this hugely beneficial tool, and then there are people saying, I think you're using it too much. So I think there is something very challenging about this sense of digital detox when we're thinking about digital autism and technology and autism. And we really need to think about the extent to which we evoke concepts like digital detox from the mainstream world of using technology too much, and how challenging that might be for the autistic community. Because this seems to be a sense and an environment where we're talking about inclusion. People, the autistic community, are referring to a sense of inclusion through using this. So they might not be intervened with, or they might not be integrated into face-to-face social interaction, but they're reporting being very happy, feeling included in this digital environment. So in this sense, the world of social media might be a very inclusive environment, if not integrative in the face-to-face environment. So that sense of inclusion versus integration it seems very predominant here, and social media seems to represent an environment that's inclusive, potentially not integrative. So Network Autism says something very interesting on this topic. Just to read through this, there is a lot of words on the slide. The positive thing about computers is that serendipity has meant that they are potentially the greatest ever asset for autistic people. So digital detox would mean I'm taking away your greatest ever asset for a week, for 2 hours, whatever it is. They open up a new world of potential friends, opportunities, and employment. That's what you want to take away. And then the key point is perhaps the non-autistic world who has concrete thinking and needs to accept change in terms of redefining friends and socializing to include social media. So there's a real call there from Network Autism about if the rest of the world changed, then we've got a really inclusive environment. Don't think about this in negative terms, think about the positive aspects that are occurring, and then we can turn this into a very inclusive environment. The internet won't disappear, so everyone must work together to make it infinitely positive and beneficial for autistic people. This is it's kind of a whole, let's level the playing field here. So it's a great kind of conceptualization and summary from Network Autism. Okay, so I'd like now to shift from social media to look at a different aspect. One is robots that's getting a lot of traction and interest recently. And sometimes what are called socially assistive robots, and how robots can be used maybe to assist that social interaction. So it's close, so what are socially assistive robots is to create close and effective interaction with a human user for the purpose of giving assistance. So you try and bond with a robot and it will have some kind of assistive role in helping you convalesce or rehabilitate or learn. And then this has been taken on within the autism literature to say there's a possibility to create a new paradigm for the treatment of ASD. And so you can see now we're looking more, we've just been talking about inclusion, but maybe this is looking more at a kind of integrative model. Robots can help the autistic person change so that they can then interact more with the world as it is. So it's more that intervention aspect rather than the inclusion. And you can see a wealth of robots that are now emerging that have a whole range of different levels of how human they look, or whether they're animal-based, or actually look like robots always did. And a series of studies look and see, well, how do autistic people interact with robots? Robots can be quite social, but they are clearly physical entities. So is there a way of bridging the non-physical strengths associated with autism with the kind of social deficits in these kind of social robots? It tends to be the thinking behind this kind of work. So an example that comes from Kim's study here is, if you can see that, you have this adult is always here, and what they want to know is how many questions is asked of the adult. So how many utterances does the child evoke and initiate? And then they have a whole range of different autistic children in here, and you have a facilitator. So they have different conditions. One is they have another adult there as well. A different condition is they have a little robot in there as well, and the third condition is they have a tablet. And then the kid is given a task to do on the table. And you can see these stars represent statistical significance to show, when you have a robot, this column is high, and this is the number of utterances down here. The child talks significantly more when the robot is present, rather than when the adult is present or when the computer is present. So evidence like this was just, robots seem to elicit some kind of social outpouring from the autistic child. But you can see here as well, this is statistically significant. When you look at the graph, you can see when the robot's there, maybe on average they say about 25 things, and when it's an adult, maybe they say, 30 things, and when it's an adult, maybe 26 things. So maybe they say 4 more words between these. This is statistically significant, but you can see the kind of the effect that's going on between an adult and a robot. It is in that direction, and it is statistically significant, but maybe 4 more words in an entire session. What does that actually mean in terms of the reality of the interaction? Similarly, a study that was out earlier this month from the States, Scazzaletti, was looking at the first naturalistic study of putting robots in the home, and they put this environment here in the home where you have a desk and you have a robot here that's next to the screen. So the setup is you're at home, you have your autistic child, and the parent is interacting with the autistic child, and there's the robot there, and they're interacting over the screen here. And what they're hoping to do is try and generate a sense of greater social engagement, have the robot facilitating interactions between the parent and the child. So this schematic of it, you have the screen here, and then maybe you can get the robot to make eye contact with the child. And I say eye contact, obviously not real eyes, but they're representing robot-like eyes. And the robot can then look at the screen, and the child looks at the screen, and then the robot looks at the adult to see whether or not the child then follows the robot's lead to have a joint attention moment with the adult. So that's the kind of scenario that they're looking to adapt. And it was the first study to put a robot in the home and see what happens. And they looked at how much of these joint attention instants occurred, and they measured it 30 days before the robot arrived, the day the robot arrived, and the robot was with them for 30 days. Then they took the robot away, and then they measured it 30 days after the robot had gone. So what they showed was, whilst the robot was there, they found an increase in the number of these joint attention, eye contact moments that occurred. However, you can see again that 30 days after the robot had gone, the effect had gone. So whilst the robot was in the home, they did find an effect, but once the robot had gone, so the effect went as well. So again, robots are showing kind of positive signs, but there seem to be a great deal of limitations at the moment. And again, it's a way of intervening to say, okay, we think joint attention is a good thing, so let's see if we can change the behaviour of that autistic child to make them engage in behaviours that non-autistic children engage in. A final example, again from Japan, was putting autistic young people in front of one of these three, and they were asking questions to see how much the autistic person responded. And they were faced with one of three, which was either a human-looking robot, a simplified robot, or an actual human. So there was one of those three we're asking, and I think it comes freakily human-looking, that robot. And then they ask the questions. Can you tell me something embarrassing that's happened to you? Can you tell me when you were happy? Kind of just general questions, and see who did the autistic people prefer interacting with out of a very human-like robot, a simplified robot, or a actual human. And found that the simplified robot was the preferred option. A lot more giving of information in terms of answering questions in that simplified human robot rather than an actual human or a human-like robot. To again suggest, they were suggesting, there's a natural tendency to interact more through this kind of digital, simplified digital, and if it gets too human-like, then it's not as preferable as when it's simplified as this central one here. So again, we're looking at that question of, is this inclusion or intervention when you're looking at robots? Are you trying to adjust that autistic person to make them more non-autistic-like so they can work within the non-autistic world? And Damien Milton, who many of you may know is an autistic author who often contributes greatly to these kind of debates, was interviewed in Wired, where they were looking about, if you're just giving robots to autistic children to keep them quiet, is that an ethical thing to do, is the kind of question they're asking, or is there something a little more beneficial to the process than that? And Damien Milton asks the question, well, why machines? Are machines the best thing to teach social interaction to people? You think, well, actually, that's a brilliant question. I think we want to teach social interaction, so what should we go to? Let's go to robots. Let's go to non-social identity. Are they really the best way of teaching social skills? If the point is to intervene and teach social skills, are non-social entities the best things to do that? So he suggests, rather than designing robots to fix autistic people, perhaps research can focus on to helping everyone else better understand the autistic condition and building up empathy between autistic and non-autistic people. And maybe these kind of interventions with robots are kind of fundamentally missing the point about what they should be attempting to achieve. And rather than enhancing understanding, then a lot of researchers have got this sense of trying to fix the autistic person, whereas in fact what needs fixing is the relationship between the rest of the world and the autistic people. So we've undertaken some research. Now I have to give full disclosure here because we were paid to do this, because there's a company called Anki who've got this robot Cosmo, and it's commercially available, so I'm going to say, full disclosure, we were paid to do that. I just wanted to give you a little demonstration, because what we wanted to know was, well, do robots, if you don't structure the situation, if you just give some robots to young people with autism, what happens? Does it elicit some kind of social interaction between them? What's the social context that can be generated? So, to kind of give you a break from me, I'm going to show you a 3-minute video of a pair of autistic boys using two anchors, just to kind of show you what we were looking at was not really the robot, but what's happening in the context of using the robots. Is there a social interaction that can be elicited within the context? So this is the kind of thing, do they talk to each other? And what's happening beyond what they're doing with the robot? And you can see here, Cosmo's kind of got these basic expressions and is kind of signalling potential emotional kind of signals through its very basic screen at the front there. Okay, now, the parents are given permission for me to show you this film, but not to record it. So if you are taking photos or whatever, I can ask that you don't take any photos of this screen. And for the recording as well, can we also cut out the element with the kids in? So as I say, just a 3-minute video, so you can see two autistic young men. Okay, so hopefully what we're interested in, it wasn't an experiment, it was just like, let's kind of see what happens. Is there some kind of, and obviously we've kind of just got highlights there, but hopefully you can see that there is a kind of interaction that's going on. So we've only just done this, so we will be looking to kind of fully analyse it, and we're also to see, what does kind of just emerge in these kind of naturalistic type settings, and kids helping each other, kids highlighting how one helping another, and all those kind of things just occurring because of the technology that's been set up there. Okay, so that's really in contrast with having a specific aim of trying to make or intervene in any kind of way. It's whether, can technology be used just to to make people feel included within an environment such as that. And we're hoping that maybe that could represent a kind of inclusive environment where people feel part of playing together, as opposed to robots that might be used to try to train autistic kids to make eye contact. So the second part really of the talk is really to focus on that sense of participation from the end user community, because to focus upon inclusion as opposed to intervention may well be coming up from the autistic community themselves. And you're really only going to know that if the autistic community are involved within the design and the development of these technologies. What do the autistic community want technology for? Is it for intervention or is it for inclusion? And how best can the views of the autistic community be integrated into that process? And Sue Fletcher-Watson has just written how research generally needs to do this a great deal more based around autism. But I'm going to focus more specifically on what's sometimes called participatory design and the development of technologies and incorporating the autistic community within the development of technologies for the autistic community. So one way of addressing this sense of inclusion rather than intervention is to work with the autistic communities to develop technology that the autistic community wants. So participatory design is often abbreviated to PD, and PD involves people who will use the technology in the process of designing, developing and evaluating it. So it's that kind of integration. Yes, we're developing it for you, so what do you want? So it's been argued that PD has the potential to enable digital empowerment and social inclusion of those involved and can be an effective forum for developing interdisciplinary research and engaging with wider communities such as the autism community. So the crucial variable there is embedded within participatory design is that sense of social inclusion. So by including people within the design process, we're also including in the broader sense the inclusion of the autistic community with the development of the technologies, because the technologies are being developed in line with what the autistic community would require. So we had a whole seminar series of this, and if you're interested in this topic, Digital Bubbles was the name of the seminar series, and there's loads and loads of information there if you're interested in that sense of design. I'm just going to give a few examples here. So one of the things that came out of that was to develop an app called Ask Me It, and that was simply to be able to interact with research and say, if you want something researched and you're a member of the autistic community, upload your idea here. And it was up to you whether you wanted to leave your contact details, but if you did, then that could then be co-developed with the autistic members of the community. And part of the Digital Bubbles had a lot of autistic people there, and this emerged from those discussions with the autistic community saying, a mode of communication, just to flag up some ideas, saying, what about doing this? So that developed the Ask Me It app, which is just a method of interacting and saying, have you thought about doing this? This is what would improve my life. And a whole series of universities coordinated on that. And then the ideas, obviously not all the ideas can get taken forward, but then it's co-created what can take and discuss what can and can't get taken forward. So I just wanted to flag that up as one mechanism by which communications can be enhanced. I was involved in a project called Ideas, which was developing protocols to enable and empower the autistic community to work within a design for a maths tutor. Now this, I'm a psychologist, and this was very much an interdisciplinary project, and Laura Benton was the PhD student, supervised by Hilary Johnson, who are from the computer science side and human-computer interaction. I won't stray into their turf, I'm more on the psychology side of things. But they're setting up protocols with how do you get then, what's the best way to engage, and these were teenagers largely, or secondary school age children, into the development of the maths tutor for autistic people. And we have a process of, first of all, if you can see that, it's a setting up the rules of what's going on. You think of a team, you identify who everyone is, and you work out rules, like I won't tell you to shut up and I will listen to other people. So you set up the rules beforehand so that if someone says, breaks the rules, you can then always refer back. And you set up a very explicit time scale of what's going to happen when and what the objectives are. So it's making the whole session very transparent and explicit. And then engaging in a series of low-level prototypes. So using plasticine to start thinking, okay, what would you like this maths tutor to look like? And here they started building a car as a part of a a journey. They were going on a journey, a maths learning journey. And then this is cardboard. It's kind of a low-tech mock-up, and Laura made this a kind of brilliant rendition of a computer. But then it's transferring it from the plasticine models and kind of drawing it how it might look on the screen, and then you can stick it on the screen. And here you are. You've kind of got the maths coming here, and you're kind of driving past the maths. And this evolved with the autistic kids coming up with maths islands, and each island was a different topic in mathematics, and you drove around in your car from island to island, and as you did it, the flags appeared. So all these design ideas were coming from the autistic community and the autistic children, and we took them back, and the programmers implemented it, and we went back and said, is this what you meant? And they said, yeah, that's good, no, I don't like that. So it was that kind of iterative process that resulted in a maths tutor that had been designed by autistic children for autistic children. And so we went on to show that yes, it did help maths learning, but actually everyone liked it. So even if you weren't autistic, the non-autistics said, oh, that's great, we like going around the islands with our little car. So like much that's designed or adapted for autistic people, there are general benefits for the learning community as a whole. Another project that I'm involved with at the moment is looking at social stories, and some of you might be familiar with the social stories intervention that is very popular in schools and with parents and actually with autistic people, because it's basically reading a story. So it's not seen as very intimidating in terms of being an intervention. And typically this is written by hand, and there's a kind of traditional paper-based way of doing it. And we've engaged in taking the idea from ideas and using those protocols to work with parents and teachers as well as the autistic children, say, well, if this was given a digital format, how would you like it to look? How would you like the pages to turn? How would you like to insert photos? So linking up all of those different aspects from the adult community as well as the child community. So that's just as an example there of a social story where you kind of might describe the situation that's going on. I want to play, and then it kind of gives you an idea of how you might approach that situation to solve. You want to play, but you don't know how to enter the game and that kind of thing. So you give the social story, and the idea behind them is it engenders a sense of understanding in children. So whilst they're widely used, and some suggest that 90% of schools are using them, half the time they're highly effective, but half the time they're not effective at all. So why might that be? And the argument is, well, it's often the variability, because you might be a very busy teacher, but if you were able to deliver this through an iPad, that would address that. So one of the things we looked at was the research, and what were the research studies looking at, and what did parents and what were they using social stories for? And the largest thing that parents and practitioners were using social stories was to help with transitions, but that wasn't where the research was. So already there was a disconnect between people who were researching social stories and people who are actually using social stories in the real world. So we developed the app that looks a little bit like this, and we were developing it with here we have 12 children, and we were looking at those who also have intellectual disability to see can we involve those, and we could. And they gave us lots of feedback. So some were autistic with learning disabilities, some just have intellectual disability. And they told us things like, if it says good work, we always want our name in there. We want it to be personalised. And this is the kind of thing we might want a big tick if we're doing well. So they just told us how to make it, really. And then as we get more right, I want my reward to get bigger and bigger. I want a little monster, then a medium-sized monster, then I want a really big monster going, grrr, if I get all my answers right. So they told us how they wanted to change it. And if you're having repeated social stories, they were able to say what they wanted, the rewards for successfully reading the social stories. So they were able to do all this very effectively. So sorry, these are a bit messy, but what I wanted to show was this is really just showing this is an increase in the desired behaviour. So for whatever, this study had 20 autistic children, and overall there was an increase in the desired behaviour that the social story was trying to address. And this second slide here breaks down the 20 different results to show you that it is a bit messy. Overall, it's hugely successful, but for some you can see there was no improvement, and sometimes the improvement's a bit random. So it's rather than just show, oh yeah, it works perfectly, there is variability in how effectively it works. Similarly, a different study, the children in the school were going on camp and they had different worries about going on camp without their parents. So they were addressed through the social stories and then asked, do you think it improved their level of understanding? And again, you can see for one kid it didn't, but for many it did. Did it reduce the child's anxiety? And mostly anxiety went down before and after using the intervention. Overarchingly, they did head towards their goals. So again, there was variability between, but overarchingly, it was a success that children did seem to understand about the social stories goal, get towards that goal, and reduce their anxiety. So I'm telling you this well because coming in 2019, we will be fully converted into an app and it will be freely available in the new year, so I can let you know more about that social stories app. So we're just in that final process now of making it freely downloadable on the iPlayer and stuff. Just a couple more very briefly. I was involved in an Erasmus-funded project called Smart ASD. And what this, again, it's all free if you go there. And there's a profile where you can identify what can my child do on an iPad, for example. Can it swipe? Can it turn it on and off? If the child can't turn the iPad on and off, then that really restricts what kind of apps might be desirable for that child. So first of all, you get a profile of what kind of apps or what the child's capabilities are in using the technology, and then based upon that and your needs, it then makes recommendations for what apps you might want. So it's a suggestion, a way of suggesting this might be, if you have that need and your child has this capability, then this app might be appropriate. As I say, the website's there and it's all freely downloadable. And associated with that is an online MOOC where you have a course that explains the whole process for you as well, and again, free to attend. That's Princess Sophie opening up MOOC. We also have a project funded by FIRA, thank you very much FIRA, called Better Evidence for Technology and Autism. And this is asking the question, what evidence do people from the autistic community want for technology? What do they want to know about? What does that evidence want to look like? And there's something called a Delphi study. We're involving the autistic community, researchers, developers, everyone who's involved in that, designers, the processors, say, what do you think evidence for digital technologies for autism might look like? And that goes round and round with people commenting on each other's comments until you get an agreed consensus about what evidence for technology should look like. So that process is going on and it'll be finishing again early in 2019, and hopefully we'll have a seminar. I don't know if the NAS will let me have your webs, but I could let you know, and you'll all be very welcome to come back here early in the new year and have a seminar, and we could disseminate the findings to you. Okay, so in conclusion then, in terms of digital autism, I think we really need to think about whether the purpose of the technologies that we are using with the autistic community are for inclusion or for intervention. And that, hopefully I've argued that the sense of participatory design and the involvement can really enhance that sense of inclusion within that. So my final plug is that we have another MOOC that's looking at good practice in autism education. So if you are involved with compulsory education, kind of 5 to 15, there's a free online course that will be starting next Monday. That's run through Future Learners, all free, again funded by Erasmus, that takes you through good practice in autism education and what inclusion means. So if you haven't had enough of me already, you can get more of me and colleagues from across Europe on what inclusion means. Okay, so thank you to these people, all of whom have been central, and thank you very much for listening.